most people defend freedom of speech for me, but not for thee. And the only difference between the right and the left is that they tend to suppress different speech, but sometimes they gang up and agree that certain speech is dangerous, maybe for different reasons. So, for example, during the last presidential campaign, both Biden and Trump agreed that social media had to be clamped down on, that government had to regulate social media speech for opposite reasons. I mean, they both said there's too much disinformation, but Trump thought that the disinformation was pro-Democrat, and Biden thought that the disinformation was pro-Republican. So that's why it is so important for any of us who believes in freedom of speech to neutrally, consistently, stubbornly, dare I say, defend it, even for the speech that we hate.
What happened to good liberals? You know those civil libertarians of old? We're going to find out. But first, subscribe and like our channel. Click on that little bell icon for notifications. And find the Devil's Advocate podcast on your favorite listening app. Nadine Strossen, I'm so glad you're here. I've just got to ask you, what happened to good liberals?
We are still here, and we are still making a lot of noise, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to do that on your important platform, John. So, I mean, the word liberal, the word conservative really has no fixed meaning and means different things to different people. I use the term liberal in the sense of a classical liberal who defends enlightened values that you rattled off and that are reflected in our Bill of Rights.
I think it was Milt Friedman who got so angry that the left stole the word liberal because liberal belongs to classic liberals. For those who don't know, you've had a distinguished career in civil liberties. You were for 18 years the president of the National ACLU. You're now with FIRE, which is a great free speech organization. You're a law professor. You've had all these awards. What draws you to the free speech movement? You've dedicated your career. Why?
Well, as somebody who is a libertarian, you, John, can understand. I think some of us, maybe all of us, are born with an innate sense of a desire for autonomy, right? A desire to make up our own minds about life's important questions. If we are fortunate to live in a society that gives us the opportunity to develop and convey our own ideas, I never took those opportunities for granted. Among other reasons, my father was a refugee from Germany who was a Holocaust survivor. My mother's family also were immigrants who were fleeing different kinds of oppression by government and religious officials in Italy and Croatia. And the civil rights movement in the United States was beginning to take shape during my childhood. So I was always aware of potentially oppressive forces that could squelch my freedom to pursue my own values and my own dreams and aspirations. I never took that for granted, and I always wanted to defend rights. And how do you defend rights without freedom of speech?
We forget that the United States is this grand experiment, basically built on a premise that the individual is sovereign, and government's job is to protect that sovereignty. You are autonomous. You can do with your life what you like, as long as you're not stealing other people's stuff or hurting people. And that's always been good. I don't think people today, particularly younger folks, understand that. They take it for granted. And they seem much more comfortable with speech codes, with pressures to make sure you say what's appropriate, not what you really want to say. So let me ask you this. In the 70s growing up, watch All in the Family, and it was all about, right to free speech. It was all about the ends don't justify the means.
Wow, do you think that show could be produced today?
No.
No.
And it was all about that. And I look today, and it's all the opposite, which is if you do have free speech and somebody says something that we find offensive as a collective, it's our job as the collective to cancel that person, to shame that person, to use the right pronoun, to use the right words, not to say these other words. And I wondered what happened to these good liberals that went to bat in Skokie, Illinois, went back to bat for pornographers, went to bat, and all the Archie Bunker types were like, this is wrong, wrong, wrong. And now it's mostly Democrats who are saying, no, free speech is wrong, wrong, wrong.
Well, I disagree with you on the premises, John, with great respect.
You don't need to have any respect. No one else does.
Throughout my lifetime, which has been quite long now, there have always been attacks on free speech coming from both ends of the political spectrum. In fact, there's a common saying among those of us who defend free speech, which is most people defend freedom of speech for me, but not for thee. And the only difference between the right and the left is that they tend to suppress different speech, but sometimes they gang up and agree that certain speech is dangerous, maybe for different reasons. So, for example, during the last presidential campaign, both Biden and Trump agreed that social media had to be clamped down on, that government had to regulate social media speech for opposite reasons. I mean, they both said there's too much disinformation, but Trump thought that the disinformation was pro-Democrat, and Biden thought that the disinformation was pro-Republican. So that's why it is so important for any of us who believes in freedom of speech to neutrally, consistently, stubbornly, dare I say, defend it, even for the speech that we hate.
Free speech is really only about defending the right for people to say crap you despise.
Exactly.
And in a way that, in a format that you might find hateful.
Right.
And I'm always surprised when I take anything, any issue, and I switch it 180 degrees, and I say, well, what if the other side was saying that?
Yes.
They would get away. I see a lot of bias in the media that way. I see a lot of bias in higher ed and K-12 and in Hollywood. Oh my God. The biggest cultural driver there is all about speech codes, not laid out, but inferred. And if you don't use the right speech, if you say the wrong things, we will shame you and ruin your life. We will isolate you. And like any good religion, isolation is the most horrible form of punishment.
Well, I'm fond of saying that today we have a similar situation to the famous opening passage in Charles Dickens' great novel, A Tale of Two Cities, the best of times and the worst of times. In terms of First Amendment free speech law, there has never been a better time when the Supreme Court justices, for all of the other differences among them, are very strongly unanimous or all but unanimous in defending freedom for every kind of controversial speech. That strong percentages of the American public think should be suppressed. The worst of times flows from that public attitude, which is we have a culture that is better described as a cancel culture than as a free speech culture.
It's better to say something like free speech is vehemently protected in the courts of law, but it is under incredible assault in the courts of public opinion.
Exactly.
What I worry about, knowing that politics is a lagging indicator of culture, this culture of cancellation, of triangulating on people that aren't popular and destroying them. Well, when these kids grow up, as this culture goes, the courts are going to follow because politics usually follows that. That's my big worry. And kids today cannot speak up to defend themselves. They'll get kicked out of school. They'll get bad grades. Workers can't stand up to what goes on with the outside pressure. They can't stand up to HR. They've got to call an obvious man a woman because otherwise they could lose their job. And they think it's a lie. And then they go home to their kids and tell their kids not to lie, but sorry, I got to lie in order to put food on the table. There's just a lot of perversity going on when it comes to free speech.
Well, you've rolled together a lot of different examples, so I can't address all of them, but I want to lay out one really important point.
By the way, you're such an attorney. I can tell no, we'll concede this at one point at a time.
I want to make it clear that we are thinking human beings, which means that we agree strongly on some points and we disagree strongly on other points, as it should be.
You're going to ask me for a deposition soon.
I think it's really important to stress that canceling in the sense of criticizing somebody strongly, advocating for them to be punished is itself an exercise of free speech. And I would not want the government to make it illegal to engage in that kind of conduct. I also defend the property rights, if you will, of private sector employers to decide whom to hire and whom to fire, unless they're violating certain anti-discrimination laws. So if they decide to put in a policy that certain speech will be permitted and certain speech will not be permitted, I defend their right to do that. However, I think, again, as the problem is a cultural one, the solution has to be a cultural one. We have to create a culture where people do not want to exercise their free speech rights of criticism or of advocating punishment in a disproportionately harsh way that goes beyond just punishing somebody who has said something that is offensive, to try to get them to rethink what they say, to creating a climate where people are constantly self-censoring. And what every survey shows, John, is that people all across the political spectrum are engaging in massive self-censorship, not expressing certain ideas, not even addressing certain whole topics for fear that they might say something unwittingly that is perceived as offensive by somebody else.
When you raise a kid, you see it. You see it. My daughter has been through this.
How old is she?
She's now 22, but growing up in the People's Republic of Boulder, they are re-education camps. The indoctrination on environmental ideology, on sexual ideology and trans, on political ideology against guns, they're indicative inside the lessons. During COVID, I got to see her classes because they were all online. I heard her history teacher talk about the problems of systematic race, critical race theory, systematic racism. I got to hear her English teacher expound on. I got to see her yoga teacher talk about it. These are ideologies that have nothing to do with the topics, but you see the indoctrination that happens. Those schools are funded by taking money out of my wallet. So they're government schools. But my little daughter, when she's 10, is not going to bring a lawsuit and go up to the ACLU and say, that thing you said in class, that's really not appropriate.
It's so interesting that you're giving examples of left-leaning indoctrination in the schools, because we have many states now where Republican legislatures and governors have passed laws that impose the opposite kind of indoctrination in the public schools that they may not teach anything about, or that is seen as promoting critical race theory or systemic racism and so forth. And I would say there are equal problems with respect to both of those from a First Amendment perspective.
But at least, and I agree with you, those Republican states that are saying, well, we're not going to do this, at least there was something of due process. They passed a law and they were out and open and saying, we don't want this philosophy. Whereas the environmentalism, the transsexual stuff, the anti-gun stuff, the victim oppressor-oppressed mentality. There was no thing saying, well, let's push that through school. We're going to put that there. No, it just naturally comes because people are people, and the teachers, particularly in a place like Colorado, which is very progressive, put it out to the next generation.
Yeah, so that's, you're saying, goes under the radar screen, and it's harder,
Can't
it's
prove it.
less susceptible to a First Amendment challenge. Let me say this, John, even beyond the First Amendment problems with, basically we're talking about government indoctrination, and that violates freedom of thought, which is an essential prerequisite for freedom of speech. They're mutually reinforcing with each other. And the Supreme Court, in one of its very, very earliest cases in which it upheld freedom of speech back in 1943, was in an ACLU case, I'm proud to say, in which we represented school children who were protected against ideological orthodoxy that was being imposed by schools that were requiring students to salute the flag and pledge allegiance to the flag. But the Supreme Court's holding went way beyond that factual situation, important as it is, and had wonderful ringing language about no government official, no matter how high or how petty, may prescribe what shall be orthodox in matters of opinion, religion, politics, etc. And I would say, in addition to that really fundamental First Amendment problem with these situations, there's also miseducation. I'm a professional educator. That's how I earn my living, as a law professor. And education is the opposite of indoctrination. It is not appropriate for any professor or teacher. I'd say, the lower down the age of the student.
You obviously did not go to the University of Colorado.
But that's so inappropriate, because our role is not to tell students what to think. It is to teach them how to think, to instill habits of mind, of critical inquiry, of debate, dissent, analysis.
Your point that the courts are very clear on free speech, right down to the right to give money to a candidate, because that's part of your ability for that person to disseminate their message. That is speech. Do this one for me. The problem is that people think corporations are people. And a corporation is not a person. Therefore, these companies, these organizations, these unions, they don't have free speech rights because they're a big, huge, multinational corporation. They should not put money into politics, because that's speech that I can't compete with. What's your reaction to that?
Well, first of all, my reaction is that as we were talking about earlier in another context, that we have to have neutral, even-handed principles about free speech, no matter who the speaker is.
When you say we're talking specifically government?
I'm talking about
culture.
We, the people in general. I'm talking about free speech as a legal right, but also as a cultural value. And we are not going to have meaningful free speech for anyone unless we have it equally for everyone. And I agree with the Supreme Court that First Amendment freedom of speech and freedom of association extend to any group of individuals who join together in whatever form of organization they choose in order to amplify their message.
So the guys I play poker with, and there's 7 of us, and we got to say, poker bros
Yes.
for this person, that even though we're presenting it as a group of poker players, it's still a group of people.
Exactly. And if you decided to form a corporation or a union or a partnership, that entity would have the right to speak on behalf of the members of that entity. And as the Supreme Court recognized, the first case in this line of cases upholding the freedom of association for people to band together to make their speech more effective, the corporation that was involved was the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, back in 1958, when the state of Alabama and other southern states were persecuting this corporation because it was allowing individuals who would not have dared to do so, speaking for themselves because of fearing economic reprisal and physical reprisal, were able effectively to speak against Jim Crow through the corporate form.
And because they kept their donors anonymous.
And their members anonymous. That was exactly...
Because you talk about economics. There's another reason. You gave money to the NAACP in that state, you could find yourself on the wrong end of a rope.
Exactly.
That this, it's life or death. So to protect my safety, I'm going to give you my money. You say what because I agree with what you're saying.
Exactly. So in order to have meaningful freedom of speech, we have to protect anonymity. We have to protect freedom of association to facilitate especially controversial messages and messages that are challenging the status quo.
How do campaign finance laws work into that? Here in Colorado, we've got very restrictive campaign finance laws. So if you're running for governor, you can ask somebody for $2,000, and then you have to ask for $2,000, and another $2,000, another $2,000, another $2,000. Jared Polis, who's worth $500 million, writes himself a check for $30 million, spends it any way he wants, and he doesn't have to go ask for money. So he's got all the time in the world to campaign when the poor schmuck who's running against him can only ask for little bits and pieces. What do campaign finance limits do to free speech?
Well, I think that for most people, certainly members of the public, they have good intentions about these laws. The goal is to make the process of running for office and influencing those who run for and are elected to office open to all members of the public and not to give disproportionate influence to those who happen to have a lot of money and power. However, that is not the way the laws actually operate. I think they are incumbents protection acts, and they're also acts that protect those who have a lot of money on their own. And they also violate freedom of speech, because if you are restricted in how much money you can contribute, that means you are restricted in how much support you can convey, how much speech you can finance, because that's the reason for collecting the money or donating the money, is to spread a certain idea, to spread a certain message. So I think that these laws are the worst of all possible worlds. They do restrict free speech. They do restrict freedom of association. They do not bring about any real equality of opportunity among candidates. I think it's no coincidence that incumbents get reelected much more easily because, by the way, the more well-known you are as an incumbent is, the easier it is for you to have a large donor base that makes small contributions.
Exactly. Your name has been out there.
Whereas if you're an upstart or unknown, you really need to get your campaign started with a few large donors from your donations from your small donor base.
What it also does is it takes away the campaign from the candidate. Mm-hmm. So while Jared Polis can run his own campaign because he's self-funded, the person running against him, well, they can only raise a little bit, but some large PAC, large something else can swoop in and decide what the message should be, out-shouting the guy who's actually running and sometimes going counter. Yeah. So let me ask you about campaign finance limits. Mm-hmm. Well, I said limits. What about disclosure? Mm-hmm. So that, isn't it the same problem that he's had with the NAACP, that if I'm going to write you a check, everybody can see it, and if they don't like that I gave it to you, think about the guy from, I'm trying to remember what it is, Firefox, the software program. He was kicked out of his position because he gave money to a anti-gay marriage campaign, and because of that, he lost his job.
And the Supreme Court, I think, has handled this very well, John. It has recognized that mandatory disclosure requirements may indeed violate people's free speech rights precisely because of the chilling effect that you talk about. And that was what underlay the NAACP ruling, that mandatory disclosure of membership could lead to reprisals, which would deter people from becoming members, which would mean the NAACP could not speak and could not effectively campaign against Jim Crow. But on the other hand, there also is a recognition that that disclosure is consistent with transparency and freedom of information, and those of us who reject strict limits on expenditures and contributions say, look, a less speech restrictive alternative is disclosure. So people can see who is contributing to these campaigns and can make a determination.
Isn't that in direct conflict with the idea of what we said about the NAACP?
But you have to,
that anonymous speech should be protected. And if your anonymous speech is vote for Frank,
right,
and you want to do that anonymously, you're saying you can't.
As with many situations, there is more than one right at stake.
I would expect a lawyer to come up with that kind of answer.
There's more than one free speech concern at stake, and there have been many, many cases in which the Supreme Court has had to wrestle with this. On the one hand, we recognize that disclosure requirements may have a chilling impact on speech. On the other hand, we recognize that disclosure requirements may be a less speech restrictive alternative to expenditure requirements. And I think the Supreme Court has been very sensible in looking at each situation on a very fact-specific basis and analyzing, in this particular situation, what is the best accommodation of the competing free speech concerns. So if you're talking about a relatively small contribution, that's not going to affect the outcome of the election, that's not going to affect the candidate's policy, there's no benefit in terms of public information to requiring the disclosure, whereas there is a benefit in terms of protecting the individual's privacy.
I find that the left is better than the right in the semantic wars. Affirmative action is not racial discrimination. Ghost guns are not people building their own guns. And then dark money might be my favorite. Oh, he takes a lot of dark money. And so what's the difference between what's disclosed, that you can go online to the Secretary of State and see what's there, versus that evil dark money? What makes the difference?
If instead of saying dark, which by the way, I think some people might think that has unfortunate racist connotations, but putting that aside, one can talk about privacy, confidentiality, protecting the right of minority perspectives and minority groups to contribute, to participate in the political process. I mean, one can describe it in ways that are very benign and positive.
So if I'm hearing you right, what we have right now you think is a pretty good balance.
Yeah.
That, for instance, a C3 or a C4 can get evil dark money. That is,
now you're getting way above my pay grade. The intricacies of campaign finance.
When it comes to somebody saying vote for Bob, that's an advocacy thing. It should be disclosed. A message of Bob is a good guy. That doesn't say vote or not, and that's kind of the system we have.
Yeah.
On this side, you have to disclose. On that side, you don't. Okay. I really want to talk to you about the woke world. I find the woke movement dangerous because I believe the words we use program our minds. The words we use allow us to take ideas and transmit ideas to somebody else. When those words are stifled or other words are pushed, what you're doing is changing the way people think. And that's the idea behind wokeness and speech codes and all the rest. You know, the idea that this poor guy has to call a man she against his will, so what is real? Where did the woke movement come from? From a free speech point of view, because it is opposite of free speech. I think it's a danger to free speech.
First of all, the fact that you have a right to say something doesn't necessarily mean that it is right to do so. And I strongly advocate people being sensitive and courteous and respectful in their exchanges with each other. I absolutely oppose government prohibiting certain language or mandating certain language because of disagreement with the ideas.
When a public school teaches kids about the 68 different genders and does the genderbread man and tells them that this is the words you use, these are not the words you use, isn't that government dictating speech?
I feel so ignorant. I would fail an exam on these concepts. So to the extent that the teacher is explaining to students what terms are considered to be polite and respectful, I'm in favor of that. But to the extent the teacher is saying you will be punished if you use the wrong word, especially if it's an absolute offense, no matter what your intent, and it's just, a slip of the tongue, I think that's really frightening. And I don't think it does anything meaningful toward the ostensible goal, which is mutual respect and dignity.
I think people of our generation have no idea of the pressure, the speech code pressure that young people go through. It is on every social media feed. It comes from every teacher. It comes from every professor. It comes from now almost every movie and TV and sitcom and all the rest. This is how you're supposed to be. All in the Family, which Archie Bunker was the villain, but a lovable villain, and it was to teach you the ideas that, I defend your right to say these things. I don't think we understand how much they are in a pressure cooker of shame and isolation. Every cult, every abuse of religion, shame and isolation is their weapon. And canceling is today's shame and isolation. And especially when you're young, it is so corruptive.
The pressure toward conformity is so strong. It is a very serious problem today, John, but I think it's important to recognize that this has always been a problem. I think that the greatest defense of free speech ever was in John Stuart Mill's classic essay on liberty, written in 1859. And if you go back and reread it, which I highly recommend everybody does every couple of years, I certainly do, he says at the very beginning and all the way through that he is not so concerned about government restrictions on speech, but he is concerned about social pressure, because he says that's a more pervasive problem, it's a more intractable problem, and it's the one that has the greatest impact on what people say and what they don't say. Alexis de Tocqueville, earlier in the 19th century, when he wrote his famous book, Democracy in America, said, there's a wonderful side of democracy, which is we don't have a monarchy and we the people wield sovereign power. But he said the downside is that we the people may exert a very sensorial impact on what other people can say. We have the tyranny of the majority over the minority. So this has been a universal problem. I have a lot of hope in young people. It's true there is a pressure to conform, but there's also a spirit of rebellion. And, social science studies show that if one nonconformist will have the courage to speak up, it becomes a lot easier for the second one. And so what we have to instill, we have to find those young people, and I find them all the time. They reach out to me and their teachers reach out to me. There is a hunger for free speech. There is a hunger for dissent. Quite frankly, I think that's part of the appeal of Donald Trump is that he's so unguarded in what he says. He's the opposite of woke, right? He's the opposite of politically correct. And I think even people who might despise him as a person and might not be fans of his policies sort of admire that aspect.
Tyranny of the majority.
Mm-hmm.
You know, people say, no, democracy, democracy, democracy. And I'll say, all right, so if 50 plus 1 of the population wants to bring back slavery, then you'd support that. And they go, ugh, no,
Yeah.
no.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, that's why we have this republic with a higher standard on certain principles.
Exactly.
That you cannot own somebody. You
Yeah.
cannot, the government can't tell you what to say or what not to say. But over the course of the nation's history, it sure seems to me that valuing that right has been diminished. That never before have we had so many young people who don't mind being monitored by the state. They don't care. They don't have no idea about privacy. They don't respect it. Don't understand why you would care if people know what you're doing. You know, they share each other's location all the time. Who cares if Uncle Sam knows it? And that they're very comfortable in saying, oh, no, you know, the majority says that's a bad word. You cannot use it. It's time to rename that mountain from Mount Evans to Big Sky Mountain because the guy Evans 100 years ago said something that we found offensive. I mean, it goes backward in time to find offense. It seems to me the respect for that principle that I defend to my death, your right to say it, it doesn't exist as much today.
You know,
am I just falling for my own confirmation bias?
I don't know the answer. I mean, I don't know whether things have gotten worse or not, but I will say this without hesitation. There are too many people who do not sufficiently value freedom, who do not sufficiently exercise their own freedom, who do not sufficiently defend and respect other people's freedom. Whether it's worse now or not, it's not a good situation now, and that's what I'm constantly struggling against. And in some ways, John, we may be the victims of our own success because in terms of legal rights, we still have a long way to go to achieve our national aspirations of liberty and justice for all. But we are infinitely closer to those goals than we were at the founding and even, you know, at the beginning of my adult lifetime. We're, you know, making progress. And it could be that young people take those freedoms for granted and are willing to give them up because they don't recall what it was like to be without them. When I talk to friends who live in authoritarian countries or countries that until recently were repressive, they are astounded at how progressives in this country who support women's rights and gay rights and so forth are so contemptuous toward freedom of speech because they know from their experience that without freedom of speech, you can't have human rights, you can't have civil rights, you can't have social justice or progress of any sort. So that's why I'm such a big exponent and put my money where my mouth is, my mouth where my money isn't, by traveling around the country, often for free, to advocate free speech, because my experience is the more people know about it, the more they support it.
In concept, they do until they find themselves offended. And I live in Boulder, Colorado, kind of the Berkeley of the Rockies, where everyone is enlightened and knows how everybody else should live and is up in everybody else's business. Oh, no, you can't use that kind of straw. You have to use a paper straw. I mean, it's all by law. And they think that they're tolerant. They think they have diversity. But tolerance and diversity means putting up with things you despise, that you hate. Maybe it's somebody using a plastic straw. Maybe it's somebody owning a gun. Maybe it's somebody who believes there's only two sexes. You might despise these things, but there isn't tolerance. And the Orwellian work that is done there to say that tolerance means you only look at this one side and we block away that side and make it illegal, that is the opposite of tolerance. The idea that words have fluid meaning now is a tool for tyranny.
Mhm.
When you can say he's a she, you're right up there with Orwell saying 2 + 2 = 5. After a while, you don't know what's real, and everything is relative.
Well, again, I have to say that I respect, and I would hope that other people would respect somebody's gender identity
Absolutely.
and try to use language that is consistent. I would oppose government punishment of using the wrong language. But again, the fact that, so to me, there's a real difference between individuals voluntarily deciding to say certain things and not say certain things.
What you just said of I would hope that people would use, the preferred pronouns, but government shouldn't be there. How come the person who says, no, I can't use your preferred pronoun because that means you're asking me to lie and I can't do that? Where's the tolerance for him or the protection or even the social pressure? I mean, you just did it right there saying, oh, I hope people use the right thing. Well, what if somebody does the wrong thing? And somebody said, oh, I wish you wouldn't do that. Who's there to say, no, he has the right to do that? And that's where I see this today as a one-way street, not a two-way street.
Well, the famous statement attributed to Voltaire, but actually came from one of his biographers, I disagree with what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it. I support that, and much more importantly, that is what the United States Supreme Court has called the bedrock principle underlying freedom of speech, that government has to remain neutral to the idea, the viewpoint, the belief that's conveyed by the speech. No matter how loathed or unpopular it might be, that is not a justification for punishing it. If you dislike it, then, explain to the person why you wish they would say what they don't want to say, or ignore them. Don't engage with them at all.
So we have this kind of bifurcated system where the courts say, you can't do this. Society says, absolutely, you can punish and cancel people. And there's this huge gray area because government is now inside of regulations and contracting and this, and if you don't have a DEI program, then we're not going to give you your contract. It gets really murky. How do you tell people on the culture side? As we say, politics is the leading indicator of culture. How do we get to people to get them to understand these concepts that are principle-based instead of sensitivity-based? That whole idea that, no, people have a right to say things you might find offensive.
I think what I've found useful, John, in my long career is to give people counter examples. So, there will be some idea that they consider to be completely offensive and that should be a justification for suppressing it. Then I can give them an example because we live in a very large, very diverse country. I can give them, excuse me, my freedom of speech is being blocked here. I can give them an example of where the idea that they consider the right one is considered offensive in some other community. And I think that all of civil liberties, including free speech, really comes down to the golden rule. If you want to have freedom for the speech that you love, you have to defend freedom for the speech that you loathe.
I don't see that coming from the woke world. I don't see that coming from those who see the world in terms of the oppressed versus the oppressor. I see that they want to equalize things as they see it, and social pressure in government is a good way to do that. I also don't see that sometimes on the social conservative right, but in a different direction. It's almost like they meet and some, on the other side of the circle. How do we get to those people who see the world of social justice to understand that, no, that guy does have the right to refer to that person as he, because that's his right. We need to celebrate that as much as this person who wants to be she.
Well, as I say, you give an example that would appeal to that person's ideology. That if their principle...
Can you give me one?
Yeah, I mean, one that I often use, I'm often talking about hate speech. I wrote a whole book about it, and most people think, oh, it's so obvious what's hate speech. But when you think about it, It's an emotion, and people, it's as subjective as anything else. One person's hated speech and hateful speech is somebody else's cherished, loving speech. The Black Lives Matter movement has been attacked as engaging in hate speech. How can Black Lives Matter advocacy be hate speech? Well, it's been attacked as hate speech against white people. It's been attacked as hate speech against police officers. By the way, Blue Lives Matter has been attacked as hate speech. All Lives Matter has been attacked as hate. The phrase free speech has been attacked as hate speech. And, I can give you documented examples. So once people understand, oh, it's not this objective term, it's really licensing anybody to pick and choose whatever ideas they hate, that's a little bit dangerous. I think I'll give up my right to label something hate speech as a recompense for my right to be protected from somebody else accusing my speech of being hate speech.
You put together a 3-part series. A lot of folks on PBS can watch, and I'm sure you can see it from Free to Choose Media, which is just this great organization that gets these ideas out. What is this series, and why should we tune in?
It's called Free to Speak. It is a 3-part documentary series, which is easily available online, including through the Free to Choose Network website. And it is a wonderful compilation of examples of censorship and free speech triumphing often against censorship from all over the world, from many, many different cultures, and involving many different perspectives and types of speech, ranging from art to politics to science to history, and some examples from earlier eras in history. And what it shows, John, is the universality of these issues, that throughout human history and around the world, every culture, every religion people have had an innate desire to express themselves, to communicate with each other, to pursue and investigate truth, whether it be philosophical or religious truth, or whether it be scientific or social scientific truth. And conversely, there have been censorial powers coming from government, every form of government, but also from society, every form of society and culture, and this constant back and forth. And I think by seeing all of those different examples, it helps to hammer home a major theme that you and I have been talking about, that if people could understand that giving a government or giving powerful social forces the prerogative of deciding that certain messages are too dangerous and therefore should be silenced, that's really dangerous to them, because it is going to result in very strong pressure to silence their cherished beliefs and ideas.
I find it sadly entertaining that during this last election season, the idea of, democracy is at stake, authoritarianism is on the rise. But the sign of authoritarianism is the phrase, "you can't say that." That's authoritarianism.
Yeah.
That's where democracy dies. When you say, no, you have to use this word. And I wish people, when they hear that, go, that is the first step towards authoritarianism. Instead of convincing me that you're right, I'll just use government or social pressure to compel you to do so.
One of the major segments in the Free to Speak series is about George Orwell and his classic dystopian novel, 1984. If people haven't reread that recently, they may have forgotten that there was a language called Newspeak, which basically consisted of a very reduced vocabulary, that the government eliminated certain words in order to eliminate the ideas that those words represented. And I think that's really true as a matter of basic human psychology and sociology. the film shows a refugee from North Korea explaining that in her society, she was born and grew up as a child in North Korea. They didn't even have a word for freedom or for human rights or for love. And as
For love.
Yeah.
They didn't have a word for love.
Because they didn't want to have that human relationship, right?
She also said they didn't have the word stress.
Because they lived in a worker's paradise. So of course there's no stress.
Nadine, thank you so much. This has been double plus good. Really, really appreciate it. And again, if people want to see the series, go to
Free to Choose Network, FTCN, easily findable through Google or any other search, will bring you to the website, and on that you can see the Free to Speak series, which you are free to watch at your leisure.
To watch.
Yeah.
Nadine, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, John. My pleasure.
If you enjoyed that conversation, by all means, click one of these other great programs. We have the best conversations with the most fascinating Coloradans. And subscribe to our channel. Just click down below and hit that little bell button too. You don't want to miss a single show.